Welcome to the mysterious casebook. Tonight, we step into Miss Marple's quiet yet razor-sharp world in the portrait that shifted its gaze at dawn. A silent crime hides behind a painted stare, and a secret waits in the first light of morning. Where are you listening from tonight? Now pour yourself something warm and let the mystery begin. St. Mary Mead rested in its usual Sunday hush, the sort that felt stitched together by polite ritual, the clink of teacups, distant hymn practice, and the soft creaking of cottage gates. The early light still lingered like pale lace over the roofs, quiet and clean, yet there was something else beneath it this morning, a faint hesitation in the air, as though the village itself had paused between breaths. Miss Marple, trimming a rose stem by her gate, felt that pause in the same way one notices a clock faltering between ticks subtle, but suggestive of some small shift about to ripple outward. The church bells began their slow rehearsal tolling, echoing through the lane like gentle summons, and people emerged in tidy trickles. Mrs. Price Ridley marched past with an exaggerated swish of her skirt, nodding to Miss Marple with unusual briskness. Too brisk, in fact, the kind that hinted she carried a remark she was dying to release upon the first warm ear. Behind her came Mr. Leonard Cruft, the churchwarden, nearly bumping into her as he stared over his shoulder with the distracted anxiety of someone replaying a private argument. It was Miss Hartnell, however, who first broke the fragile equilibrium. Arms full of embroidered cushions meant for the church pews, she stopped suddenly in the middle of the lane, pursing her lips at something she remembered or had been told. Her voice, sharpened by the weight of gossip she had not yet shared, floated out, "Well, if that business at old Stanton House is true, then it's a wonder anyone slept at all." Miss Marple looked up gently, the rose stem still between her fingers. "Oh, has something happened at old Stanton House?" Miss Hartnell lowered her arm full of cushions, breath quickening with both eagerness and self-importance. "They say, mind you, I'm only repeating what Mrs. Larchwood claims she overheard. They say the portrait in the East Gallery was found shifted, as though it had moved during the night." She shivered dramatically, though the air was mild. "And you know as well as I do, dear Miss Marple, that it hangs opposite the windows. No breeze could have turned it." The thought drifted through the lane like a chill thread of smoke. St. Mary Mead thrived on sensible explanations, lost knitting needles, misdelivered letters, the vicar's propensity to muddle sermon papers, but a portrait shifting its gaze unbidden was something else. Something that whispered of disturbance, of a story waiting to be uncovered. But Miss Marple merely smiled, though her eyes quelled none of the curiosity. Well, pictures can be temperamental things. Old frames warp in the night air. Warp? Miss Hartnell sniffed. Nonsense. If you ask me, someone was in that house who ought not to have been. The place is practically begging for mischief, with Sir Alister away in London for weeks. A quiet rustle behind them revealed the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, carrying a tray of flower arrangements to the church. She paused just long enough to murmur, "Mrs. Larchwood said she heard footsteps near the East Gallery. At dawn, no less." Her face carried the sympathetic worry of someone recalling an unpleasant detail she wished she could dismiss, though perhaps she was half dreaming. Miss Marple noted the hesitancy. Dawn. Not the sort of hour one forgets or imagines lightly. As the small cluster continued toward the church, their whispers stretching like vines between them, Miss Marple paused to collect her gloves. She sensed quietly, unmistakably, that the village was shifting out of equilibrium. Not with fear yet, but with expectancy, the kind that prickled behind polite smiles. Old Stanton House stood at the far end of the village, tall and grey, its many-windowed face often mistaken for disapproval. The portrait Miss Hartnell mentioned was, Miss Marple knew, of Sir Alister's late grandmother, a stern-eyed matron whose family had, for decades, served as the centre of the house's social mythologies. That such a woman's painted gaze might turn unexplained was precisely the sort of detail St. Mary Mead would embellish until it became legend. Yet even that curious suggestion might have been dismissed as village fancy, were it not for what Miss Marple noticed next. As she made her way up the path toward the church, she saw Inspector Weatherby's motor car parked near the lich gate. He rarely appeared on a Sunday unless something had happened he could not easily ignore. He stood near the entrance, hands clasped behind him, his expression tightened beneath the brim of his hat. He spoke quietly to Dr. Hayward, who looked decidedly grim, as though he had been roused before sunrise. The two men acknowledged Miss Marple with polite nods, but neither volunteered information. Their restraint said more than words. Something was seriously amiss at old Stanton House. Inside the church, the atmosphere trembled with suppressed speculation. Mrs. Price Ridley deliberately positioned herself in a pew where she could survey everyone and deliver pointed whispers at intervals. Miss Marple took her usual place toward the side aisle, where stained glass light fell in soft squares across the floor. The vicar cleared his throat repeatedly, glancing toward the doors, distracted in a manner uncharacteristic even for him. Then, just before the organist began the prelude, Inspector Weatherby stepped forward to murmur a few words into the vicar's ear. The vicar's hand came to his mouth, his eyes widening with that mixture of sorrow and obligation that precedes unwelcome announcements. When the hymn faded, he stood before the congregation, gripping the lectern a touch too tightly. "I'm afraid," he began gently, "there has been a most distressing discovery at old Stanton House." His voice wavered, yet carried through the quiet nave. "One of the staff, Miss Clara Henshaw, was found this morning in the East Gallery. She has passed away, under circumstances that appear unnatural." A ripple, sharp, silent, unanimous move through the pews. Mrs. Hartnell dropped one of her embroidered cushions with a gasp. Mrs. Price Ridley clutched her handbag as if it might steady her. The church seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Miss Marple did not move, but her eyes deepened with thought. A portrait shifting its gaze. Footsteps at dawn. And now a death unnatural. The vicar had said precisely where the disturbance had begun. The clock of village equilibrium had indeed hesitated between ticks, and now it would not strike cleanly again. She folded her gloves softly in her lap, listening as the rumors began their first quiet stir. The murmur in the church swelled like a cautious breeze gathering strength, each whisper curling back toward Miss Marple as though seeking confirmation she didn't possess. Her gloves rested lightly in her lap, and she watched the subtle shifts of expression around her widened eyes, tightened lips, the uneasy glances that darted between pews. Secrets stirred instinctively when tragedy touched St. Mary. Mead people began rearranging their recollections even before they were asked for them. Inspector Weatherby stepped aside to let the vicar compose himself, his stance stiff with the tension of a man bracing for questions he couldn't yet answer. Dr. Hayward slipped out of the church, more grim than before, clearly summoned back to old Stanton House. That detail alone set a faint prickle of unease through the congregation. A simple fall or collapse did not require such urgency. Miss Marple rose with the others as the vicar concluded the abbreviated service. Outside, the autumn air carried a sharper edge. Clusters formed with remarkable speed little knots of concern, curiosity, or thinly veiled satisfaction at knowing something dreadful before the rest of the county did. Mrs. Price Ridley wasted no time. "Of course," she declared to anyone near enough to hear, "that house has been neglected dreadfully while Sir Alister gallivants about in London. Standards slip, and then tragedies happen." Her disapproval settled over the lane like a lace shawl. A young woman alone in a gallery at dawn most improper. Miss Marple joined the slow stream toward the lich gate, noting how quickly conjecture rearranged itself into confident statements. Miss Hartnell, flustered but invigorated, clutched her cushions as though they might shield her from scandal. Footsteps at dawn? I said so, didn't I? Someone was prowling. Clara Henshaw must have interrupted them. Poor girl, but what would she be doing in the East Gallery at that hour? Asked Mrs. Clement softly, brows drawn in troubled thought. She was not known for early rising. Her voice carried a tremor of sympathy. Clara had helped arrange flowers for more than one parish fete. A few steps away, Mr. Leonard Cruft muttered to the churchwarden's assistant, his gaze averted. Nothing good ever happens in that gallery. It's gloomy as a vault. Should have had proper electrical work done years ago. Miss Marple listened, absorbing not only the words, but the tone beneath them, the hastily erected barriers of propriety, the faint cracks in composure, the uncomfortable awareness that any of them might be asked where they had been at dawn. From the corner of her eye, she saw Inspector Weatherby heading toward his motor car. He paused, just briefly, as if debating whether he ought to speak with her. But the moment passed, and he departed without approaching. That, she thought, suggested the investigation was still in its first uncomfortable stirrings, and perhaps he feared premature speculation from even the mildest sources. Miss Marple set off down the lane at a measured pace. The sunlight caught the rooftops, but its warmth felt subdued, as though the village itself were dimming in acknowledgement of the tragedy. A symbolic thread something about the portrait shifting its gazer return to her mind, not as superstition, but as an echo of the larger theme that had begun to unfold. Things altered not by chance, but by unseen intentions. As she reached her garden gate, a quiet voice called after her. Young Emily Carter, breathless from hurrying, clutched her school satchel. Miss Marple Gran said I was to fetch you if you came out. She says you ought to hear what Mr. Larchwood told her this morning. Emily swallowed. About the gallery door. Miss Marple turned with a gentle nod, careful not to alarm the child. Well now, that does sound rather important. Shall we go together? Emily nodded and walked beside her, small footsteps quick to match the older woman's steady pace. The girl's anxious energy made the air feel tighter, as though something unsaid had already taken root. They turned toward the Larchwood cottage at the edge of the green, its windows bright in the afternoon sun. But something in Emily's hesitant glance, flicker of uncertainty, she tried to mask, that whatever her grandmother wished to reveal would deepen the shadows already gathering around old Stanton House. Miss Marple lifted the latch on the gate, sensing the weight of the next revelation waiting just beyond the threshold. The latch clicked softly beneath Miss Marple's hand, and the faint scent of lavender drifted from the Larchwood's front garden. Emily hurried ahead to knock, and before the sound had fully settled, Mrs. Larchwood herself appeared with an apron still on, cheeks pink with agitation. Her eyes darted toward the lane as though ensuring no one else lurked within earshot. "Come in, Miss Marple. Do come in," she whispered, ushering her into the sitting room where the lace curtains trembled slightly in the afternoon breeze. "I told Emily it was best you heard it directly. People are already saying such wild things." Miss Marple took a seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "You mentioned something about the gallery door." Mrs. Larchwood sank into the chair opposite her, leaning forward with the earnestness of one who both fears and relishes her own information. Mr. Larchwood passed old Stanton House early this morning on his way to check the traps near the brook, and he swears the east gallery door was ajar, wide enough for someone to slip through. "And mind you," she added, lowering her voice, "that door is usually kept bolted. Miss Henshaw herself told me so during the spring cleaning." Emily hovered near the doorway, listening intently. Miss Marple smiled softly to reassure her. "And did your husband see anyone?" "No, not a soul," Mrs. Larchwood replied, though her fingers fidgeted with the corner of her apron. "But he said it gave him a queer feeling, like the house was watching." She hesitated, embarrassed at the fancy. Not the house exactly, but the windows. as though someone inside was waiting. A small symbolic shiver passed through Miss Marple's thoughts. Appearances and truth, how often they diverged. A slightly open door spoken of as though it had intent a portrait whose gaze seemed changed. People saw what matched their fears or hopes long before they saw facts. "Did he close the door?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Oh, heavens, no. He thought it best not to touch anything." Mrs. Larchwood paused, but he did hear something, a sort of scraping sound, like a chair being moved, he said. Though when he listened again, it stopped. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind catalogued each detail. A chair moved near dawn. A portrait shifted. A young woman died in the same gallery, and now an unbolted door that ought not to have been open at all. Before she could inquire further, a brisk knock sounded at the front door. Emily startled, but Mrs. Larchwood straightened, patting her apron into smoother folds. When she opened it, Inspector Weatherby stepped inside, removing his hat with a nod. "Mrs. Larchwood, Miss Marple." His tone held courtesy, underpinned by urgency. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I was told your husband might have observed something unusual at Old Stanton House this morning." "He's out checking the far traps," Mrs. Larchwood said, flustered. "But I've told Miss Marple what he mentioned." Weatherby's gaze shifted to her with a faint, appreciative tilt of his head. "Then I expect you've already drawn the sensible questions I intended to ask." He hesitated. "Still, I should like to hear your impression, Miss Marple." She met his eyes with mild composure. "It seems, Inspector, that the gallery door was unbolted earlier than usual, and that a sound was heard, perhaps furniture being moved." Weatherby's jaw tightened. "We found no chair out of place. But the dust suggests one may have been moved recently." He exhaled, weary. And the portrait, well, it certainly wasn't aligned with the nail properly when we arrived. "Frames do shift," Mrs. Larchwood offered quickly, as though trying to diminish her own earlier fancies. "Yes," Weatherby allowed. But combined with Miss Henshaw's death, his voice trailed off, leaving space for the implications to gather silently. Miss Marple watched him with quiet sympathy. Weatherby was competent, a sensible man navigating a village where truth hid behind too many curtains. He hesitated again before continuing. "I don't suppose either of you noticed anyone out early. A light in a window, a figure moving along the lane." Mrs. Larchwood shook her head. Emily mimicked the gesture, lips pressed tight. "I thought as much." Weatherby replaced his hat. "I must speak to Mr. Larchwood as soon as he returns, and Miss Marple, if you hear anything at all, I shall let you know," she said, her tone both warm and disarming. After he left, the room settled into a thoughtful hush. Mrs. Larchwood resumed nervously smoothing her apron, while Emily stared fixedly at the floor, as though recalling something she wasn't sure she ought to share. Miss Marple rose, sensing the girl's unspoken tension. "Emily, dear, is there something on your mind?" Emily hesitated, eyes flicking toward her grandmother, then back to Miss Marple. "It's just when Gran said the house was watching, I thought I saw someone near the gallery window yesterday. Someone I didn't recognize." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and they looked frightened. The whisper left Emily pale, and her fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel as though afraid her words might drift beyond the room. Miss Marple offered her a gentle nod, one meant to steady rather than press. "Someone you didn't recognize?" she asked softly, inviting clarity without cornering the child. Emily's gaze lifted with hesitation. They were standing very still. Near the window of the east gallery, I thought they were crying. Her voice faltered, but when I looked again, they stepped back quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. Mrs. Larchwood gasped, hand flying to her throat. "Emily, why didn't you tell me this before?" "I wasn't sure," Emily whispered. "It was getting dark, and I thought maybe it was just the shadows." Shadows. Miss Marple repeated the notion in her mind, considering how easily the imagination embroidered what it only half saw. Yet Emily's sincerity was unmistakable. Children rarely lied well about fear. Did this person resemble anyone from the village? Miss Marple asked. Emily shook her head. They had a hat pulled low and a coat too big for them. Mrs. Larchwood blanched. A stranger near the house last evening, and now poor Clara is gone. Oh, I don't like it, Miss Marple. I don't like it at all. Miss Marple allowed a faint hum of agreement, though her thoughts moved in quieter channels. A stranger might conveniently serve the village's need to distance guilt, but strangers seldom navigated local footpaths or found their way to isolated galleries without purpose. Still, the image Emily described could not be dismissed. Fear, in any form, suggested vulnerability as much as danger. She rose with a soft smile toward Emily. You've been very brave to tell me. That sort of detail can be most helpful, even if it seems small. Mrs. Larchwood hurried to fetch her shawl. At the very least, Inspector Weatherby must hear it. I'll not have people thinking we kept it quiet. But when Miss Marple stepped back into the lane, shawled and thoughtful, she nearly collided with Mr. Leonard Cruft. The churchwarden's face was flushed and his breath uneven, as if he had hurried from somewhere he ought not to have been. Miss Marple fancies seeing you here. His voice wavered between forced cheer and discomfort. Terrible business about young Clara. Terrible. Yes, she replied gently. You knew her fairly well, I believe. She was often helping at church functions. Cruft fumbled with his pocket watch. Oh, yes. Dutiful girl, always reliable. Quiet, too. You know the type. Miss Marple observed the tremor in his fingers. I imagine the police have already asked where you were this morning. He stiffened. Naturally. I was attending church matters, the inventory for harvest donations. Nothing unusual. His eyes darted toward Old Stanton House, visible through a gap in the hedges. Can't imagine who'd harm her. His anxiety lingered in the air after he walked on, the way the scent of nervous perspiration does after a strained handshake. Miss Marple tucked the observation away. Men like Leonard Cruft Proud, rigid, protective of their authority, could hide desperation behind propriety. And desperation, she knew, was a motive with many disguises. Continuing down the lane, she noticed Mrs. Price Ridley standing sentinel near the green, ready to intercept passers-by. The woman's hat tilted slightly askew, betraying haste. Miss Marple. You've heard, of course. She leaned forward conspiratorially. I dare say the police will look closely at that caretaker. What's his name, Mr. Rowan? Lives alone in that dreadful little cottage by the wood. These solitary men are always peculiar. Miss Marple gave her a mild, non-committal smile. Mr. Rowan has been caretaker there for nearly 8 years. All the worse, Mrs. Price Ridley declared triumphantly. Plenty of time to brood. I saw him skulking along the path last week near the orchards, and he nearly jumped when he realized I noticed him. The accusation was convenient. Miss Marple thought solitary men often became lightning rods for village anxiety. Yet she remembered Rowan as soft-spoken, careful with his hands when trimming hedges, and unfailingly polite. Appearances lied, but so too did fear. Still, she tucked the remark into her growing pattern of impressions. A stranger in an oversized coat, a churchwarden with trembling hands, a caretaker ripe for suspicion, and a young woman whose dawn death now drew every latent unease into the open. As she resumed her walk, the distant silhouette of Old Stanton House rose above the hedgerows, grey, silent, and watchful. Something about it felt heavier now, as though its windows held more secrets than the village dared guess. Miss Marple paused at the bend in the road, her gaze narrowing thoughtfully. Something or someone was beginning to emerge from the edges of the story. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer at the bend, the house's stillness pressing like a question that had not yet found its voice. A soft rustle through the hedge drew her attention. Mr. Rowan, the caretaker himself, emerged from the narrow footpath that led toward the estate. His cap was pulled low, and a twig caught in his coat sleeve suggested he had come through the woods rather than the main drive. He faltered when he saw her, surprised yet polite. "Afternoon, Miss Marple." His voice held the same steady mildness she remembered. But something beneath it, a dull strain, perhaps caught her ear. "Good afternoon, Mr. Rowan," she replied with gentle warmth. "You must be having a terribly difficult day." Rowan's gaze drifted toward old Stanton House. "Hardest I've had in years. Miss Henshaw was a good girl, always kind with her words." He swallowed, jaw tightening. Didn't deserve any of it. Miss Marple observed him in silence, allowing space for truth to loosen. It often did when not forced. Rowan shifted his weight. "Inspector Weatherby's been over every hallway already, asking where I was, if I heard anything. I told him I was up by the orchard cottage all night. The storm weakened the roof last week. None of them ever look up there," he added with a faint bitterness. "They think caretakers sleep through everything." His tone didn't carry resentment so much as weary self-protection. Appearances versus truth. A man seen as sullen when he was merely overworked and overlooked. "You were repairing the roof at dawn?" Miss Marple asked softly. He hesitated just a breath, but enough to mark uncertainty. "Near enough," he said finally. "Light comes early this time of year." Miss Marple did not press the matter. Instead, she let her eyes drift to the path he'd come through. A thin sweep of crushed leaves marked where someone had passed earlier, lighter footsteps than Rowan's heavy boots. "Would you know?" she asked gently. "If anyone else has been near the East Gallery entrance recently?" Rowan frowned. "Not that I've seen. But the lock's temperamental. If someone knew how to lift it just so his sentence faded, as though he regretted giving shape to the possibility. I'll have to fix it myself before it becomes a proper hazard." She thanked him, and Rowan nodded before trudging toward the caretaker's shed, shoulders rounded with fatigue. Miss Marple continued along the lane, thoughts threading together with quiet precision. Alibis that didn't quite fit. A stranger in an oversized coat. A portrait nudged from its place, and now a lock that might be coaxed open rather than forced. Not evidence, not yet, but a pattern of human intention starting to shimmer beneath the surface. She reached Old Stanton House as Inspector Weatherby was stepping out onto the gravel path. A uniformed constable trailed behind him, carrying a notebook filled with unsteady handwriting. "Miss Marple," Weatherby said, straightening slightly. His expression held both welcome and constraint. "I hope you're not here out of morbid curiosity." Only concerned, she returned pleasantly. "And perhaps a wish to understand what poor Clara may have seen." He studied her a moment, knowing she would not be dissuaded, then nodded for her to follow him to the east side of the house. "Very well, but only for a moment." They stopped outside the gallery door. The bolt was indeed slightly misaligned, as though strained by frequent improper handling. Weatherby tapped it with his gloved finger. The bolt should rest flush. It doesn't. Miss Marple bent slightly, noting a tiny curl of flaked paint along the frame. "It appears someone may have nudged it repeatedly from inside." Weatherby's brow rose. "You see why this bothers me?" "Indeed." He hesitated before adding, "There's something else. Something we found beneath the portrait." He led her into the gallery, where sunlight filtered across dust and shadows. The portrait loomed above the far wall stern, imposing, its gaze seeming to follow every movement. Beneath it, on a small side table, lay a polished brass button, slightly dulled by handling. "One of Clara's last tasks," Weatherby said quietly, "was dusting this table. She was meticulous. This wasn't here last night." Miss Marple leaned closer, noticing the faint indentation of thread still clinging to the button's back. A button rarely came loose without some force or movement, and this one was of a type she recognized. Not from Clara's uniform, not from any servant's uniform, but from a man's coat. She straightened slowly, her expression composed, though her mind had begun to form a new, troubling outline. When she spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. "Inspector, this button, have you determined who might have worn it?" Weatherby shook his head. "Not yet, but I have a suspicion." Miss Marple's gaze drifted unbidden to the gallery window where Emily had seen a frightened stranger the night before. The pressure in the room deepened, as though waiting for something to step forward from the shadows. Miss Marple let her gaze rest on the gallery window a moment longer, the memory of Emily's frightened description layering itself over Weatherby's discovery. The brass button gleamed faintly on the table, catching the thin spill of light from the windows, shining a quiet reminder that something, or someone, had brushed too close to secrets meant to stay hidden. Weatherby cleared his throat. "We'll compare this to the coats of everyone with access to the house. Servants, tradesmen, villagers who've been inside recently." His tone was steady, but the crease between his brows deepened, though one name has already been mentioned to me. Miss Marple gave him a soft, inquisitive look. "Leonard Cruft," he said reluctantly. "Seems he had a reason to be here last night. Claims it was about church linens Mrs. Henshaw was mending for the harvest service. But Mrs. Henshaw's duties didn't include linens." Miss Marple felt the faintest tightening in her chest, not surprise, but recognition. Cruft's earlier unease, his trembling hands, his forced cheer, all small signals now illuminated by a more troubling implication. "And Mr. Cruft's coat?" she asked lightly. Weatherby exhaled. Dark wool, missing a button. The gallery's stillness thickened. Outside, a crow cawed once an abrupt metallic sound that seemed to punctuate the inspector's words. But Miss Marple's mind moved with gentler caution. A loose button and a misplaced alibi did not make a murderer. People often lied to preserve dignity rather than conceal crimes. And Leonard Cruft, with his anxious pride, seemed precisely the sort to hide something embarrassing, not violent. Still, it was not a detail to be dismissed. Before she could speak, footsteps approached. A constable guided Mrs. Price Ridley into the gallery, her indignation preceding her like a stiff breeze. "I simply will not have my name written down as a witness," she declared, chin lifted defiantly. "I only mentioned what I saw because it was my civic duty. And if Mr. Cruft was lurking about the house last evening, well, I should hope the police do something sensible about it." Weatherby rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Price Ridley, no one suggested you were a witness in any incriminating sense." "Well, you implied it," she insisted, "and I have nothing whatsoever to do with any misbehavior occurring in this dreadful room." Miss Marple watched her shrewdly. Mrs. Price Ridley was not merely indulging in dramatic fuss, she was nervous. Not guilty, necessarily, but aware of something she was trying very hard not to reveal. "Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple said gently, "you mentioned earlier that you saw Mr. Cruft near the orchards last week. Was he alone?" The woman froze mid-breath. "Alone? Of course he was alone. Why wouldn't he be?" Her tone rang too sharply, too quickly. "Sometimes," Miss Marple continued in her mildest voice, "men who guard their reputations closely prefer not to be seen visiting certain people. It can give entirely the wrong impression." Mrs. Price Ridley flushed, her composure cracking. "I did see him speaking to someone," she admitted at last. "But I couldn't make out who. Twilight is hardly ideal for clear seeing." "And might they have been arguing?" Miss Marple asked softly. The woman's silence answered more surely than words. Weatherby straightened, alert. "Are you saying Cruft was meeting someone secretly? Perhaps Miss Henshaw?" Mrs. Price Ridley stiffened as though struck. "Certainly not. Clara Henshaw was a respectable girl. She would never." Her protest ended abruptly. The very excess of her denial gave it away. Miss Marple watched the inspector's expression darken as he pieced together the implications. A clandestine meeting. A man prone to fluster. A young woman is seen distressed near the gallery window, and now a button, its presence betraying an encounter near the portrait. But there was something quieter, yet unmistakably off Mrs. Price Ridley's fear. Not of suspicion, but of scandal. Respectability was her armor, and she was terrified it might crack. "Mrs. Price Ridley," Miss Marple said kindly. "Sometimes people keep secrets not because they are wicked, but because they wish to protect someone else." The woman's lips trembled. "I saw Clara leaving the orchards 2 evenings ago," she whispered. "And she did look, I don't know, troubled." Weatherby took a sharp breath. "And you didn't report this?" The woman bristled again. "I didn't think it was important. A young woman can be troubled for all sorts of reasons." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle expectation. "Yes," she said softly, "but some reasons lead them to places they never meant to find themselves." The remark hung between them, subtle yet heavy. Mrs. Price Ridley looked away, unable to meet Miss Marple's eye, and for a fleeting moment, guilt, pity, and fear all flickered across her face like shifting light behind a veil. It was enough to unsettle the inspector, and enough to stir a new, quieter suspicion in Miss Marple's mind, one that had nothing to do with Leonard Cruft at all. Mrs. Price Ridley's troubled expression lingered in the air long after the constable escorted her from the gallery. Miss Marple, still standing near the portrait, watched the faint tremor of light on the brass button as the inspector paced in short, agitated steps. He had the look of a man trying to align too many pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. "She's holding something back," Weatherby muttered. "They always do, these ladies of the parish. They think a bit of tidiness can be applied to murder." Miss Marple offered a mild, sympathetic smile. "People are often tidier with the truth than with their cupboards, Inspector." He stopped pacing. Cruft must be questioned again. If he was in the orchards with Miss Henshaw, if they argued, his voice trailed off as he turned toward the window. Outside, the estate grounds shimmered under the thinning light, the gravel path pale against the looming shape of the orchard trees. A gust of wind brushed against the glass, stirring a faint creak from the portrait's old frame. Miss Marple glanced at the movement. "She does seem determined to witness everything," she murmured, only half in jest. Weatherby didn't smile. "I don't like this room. Nothing stays where it ought to." Before either could continue, hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. A constable burst into the gallery, face flushed from exertion. "Inspector, there's been another discovery down by the orchard path." Weatherby stiffened. "Another body?" "No, sir," the constable said quickly. "Not that. But we found something hidden under the old bench. Something wrapped in cloth." The inspector's jaw tightened. "Show me." Miss Marple followed at a respectful distance as they descended the hall and exited onto the gravel. The orchard path cut through dwindling rows of apple trees, their branches reaching like thin, arthritic fingers toward the dimming sky. Beneath the gnarled shade, the wooden bench stood half sunken in moss. The constable pointed to a bundle nestled beneath its dirty linen wrapped around a small cylindrical shape. Weatherby crouched and unfolded the cloth with measured care. Inside lay a silver candlestick. It gleamed faintly despite the grime, its base dented in a way that spoke of sudden, violent impact. The air between them seemed to thicken with implication. Weatherby exhaled sharply. This wasn't here yesterday. Whoever hid it did so in haste. Miss Marple stepped closer. The candlestick bore the crest of old Stanton House, a curled leaf motif, delicately carved. She knew the pattern. She had seen its twin on the mantelpiece in the upstairs drawing room nearly 10 years ago during a charity tea. A symbolic detail flickered in her thoughts, the portrait whose gaze shifted the candlestick hidden beneath a bench. Objects displaced, roles reversed, appearances masking intent. Something here was being rearranged, not merely concealed. Weatherby rose, holding the candlestick in a cloth. This will change everything. If this was the weapon, Miss Marple's voice entered gently into the gap. Do we know it was used as a weapon, Inspector? Or only that someone wished it not to be found? He frowned. Clara suffered a blow to the head. The medical exam suggests a heavy object. This is heavy enough. Indeed, Miss Marple said, though her tone held a quiet caution. But one must wonder who had cause to remove it from the house, and why it was not simply thrown away. Her gaze drifted toward the orchard trees. The earth there was disturbed in small patches, footprints overlapping footprints, forming muddled impressions. Appearances deceived, the ground rarely lied. Weatherby followed her line of sight. We'll have the prints photographed. But with so much foot traffic today, Miss Marple hummed thoughtfully. Yes. Still, sometimes the order of impressions tells a story, even when the shapes cannot. The inspector gave her a look of weary gratitude. You always notice what everyone else overlooks. I've simply learned, she replied softly, that people hide truths the way birds hide shiny things never far from their nests. As they stood together, a distant shout rose from near the boundary wall. Another constable came running, breathless and alarmed. Inspector Weatherby! Someone's gone into the woods, the same figure spotted earlier. The coat was too large and the hat pulled low. We tried to call out, but they bolted deeper in, lost them among the trees. The orchard path seemed suddenly darker, the shadows pooling like ink between the trunks. Weatherby cursed under his breath. Whoever that is, he said, tightening his grip on the candlestick, they're connected to this. I know it. Miss Marple felt the shift as surely as a change in weather. The investigation, once meandering through gossip and uneasy recollections, now tugged sharply in a new direction toward someone frightened enough to hide, yet brave enough to linger near the scene of death. Her eyes narrowed just slightly. Whoever fled into the woods was no stranger, she suspected. Not to the house, not to Clara, and not to the truth. The rustle of the woods still echoed faintly as Miss Marple watched the constable retreat toward the orchard, leaving behind an air of unsettled urgency. Inspector Weatherby stood rigid, his grip on the cloth-wrapped candlestick tightening as if he feared the truth might slip from his grasp. Miss Marple, however, felt the shift within the investigation with a quieter clarity and acceleration of hidden tensions, like a thread pulled too sharply on an embroidered cushion. She stepped away from the orchard's edge, her gaze drifting thoughtfully to the house. Inspector, she said gently, I wonder if it might be wise to speak again with the staff. Those who knew Clara's routines best may have noticed changes in her demeanor these past days. Weatherby hesitated. You think her death was premeditated? I think Miss Marple replied with a soft smile, that Clara saw something or someone she did not know how to reconcile. The motif of appearances against truth shimmered beneath her words. A frightened figure at the window, a hidden candlestick, a button dropped in haste, all small shifts in a larger portrait whose composition had not yet settled. Weatherby nodded and motioned toward the servants' quarters. Miss Marple followed him through the narrow hallway, where low ceilings and worn carpet hinted at a well-kept but aging household. A young maid, Alice Whittam, waited near the door, wringing her hands, her apron slightly askew. Miss Whittam, Weatherby said, Miss Marple and I have a few questions. The girl swallowed hard. I've told the police everything, sir. Truly I have. Miss Marple approached with grandmotherly calm. And you've done very well, my dear. But sometimes the smallest impression can become meaningful later. We would be grateful for anything you recall. Alice's gaze fluttered uncertainly. She looked like a bird debating whether to trust an offered hand. I didn't want to get anyone into trouble. Kindness can be quite dangerous when misplaced, Miss Marple murmured. Better to set things straight early. Alice nodded, inhaling shakily. Clara was unsettled yesterday. She kept glancing toward the gallery door as if expecting someone to appear, and she seemed frightened when Mr. Cruft called on the house. Weatherby stiffened. Cruft was here yesterday? Alice nodded again. He said it was about hymnals left from last month's recital, but Clara avoided speaking to him. She even went the long way round to the dining room rather than pass him in the hall. That painted a portrait more nuanced than simple conflict. Fear and avoidance suggested intimacy gone sour, or secrets shared unwillingly. "Did you know," Miss Marple asked gently, "if Clara was seeing anyone?" Alice flushed. She didn't speak much about her private life, but I think someone was writing her letters. She hesitated. She kept a ribbon-tied bundle in her drawer. Pink paper. Very neat. Love letters? Weatherby pressed. I suppose so. Miss Marple's eyes warmed with empathy. People often keep their most vulnerable hopes on pretty paper. Alice's voice lowered further. There's more. Yesterday evening, when I passed the east window, I saw Clara talking to a man in the orchard. I couldn't see his face because of his hat, but she looked upset, like she was begging him not to do something. Weatherby's jaw tightened. Begging? Alice nodded. She put her hand on his arm. He shook it off. The words struck with quiet force. Miss Marple felt them settle like dust on an untouched shelf, subtle but decisive. "Thank you, Alice," she murmured. "You've helped more than you know." After the girl was dismissed, Weatherby looked to Miss Marple with troubled frustration. This is pointing more and more toward Cruft. A secret meeting, a button left behind. Clara is frightened of him. Miss Marple's head tilted slightly, the gesture delicate as a turning page, and yet hurried hiding of evidence suggests panic, not calculation. Panic usually belongs to someone weaker, not someone accustomed to authority. Weatherby frowned. Then who? The stranger Emily saw? The figure who fled into the woods? Miss Marple offered no direct answer. Instead, her eyes followed the hallway toward the grand staircase, where an older servant carrying linens had paused to listen before moving quickly out of view. People rarely moved quietly when they felt innocent. "I would like," she said calmly, "to ask one more person a few questions. Someone who has kept unusually silent through all of this." Weatherby blinked. "And who is that?" Miss Marple gave him a quiet, almost wistful smile. The person who stood closest to Clara's daily duties, the one who would have noticed changes before anyone else. She stepped lightly toward the servants' corridor, voice lowering to a murmur. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Alton." A flicker of unease crossed the inspector's face, an instinctive recognition that the game had changed again. For the first time, someone not previously suspected stepped into the frame. Miss Marple moved down the servants' corridor with the quiet certainty of someone following a thread others had overlooked. Inspector Weatherby kept pace beside her, though his stride bore a tautness that betrayed both impatience and growing respect. At the end of the hallway, the housekeeper's door stood partially open, just wide enough to reveal Mrs. Alton folding linens with stiff, mechanical precision. Atai. The sound of footsteps, Mrs. Alton straightened, smoothing her apron. Her face was composed, but her hands did not quite follow suit. They lingered too long adjusting the same fold, revealing the smallest tremor. "Mrs. Alton," Weatherby said, stepping forward, "we'd like to ask a few questions." The housekeeper nodded, though her expression carried an unmistakable resignation, as though she had sensed this moment approaching long before they arrived. "Of course, Inspector, though I fear I've already said all I know." Miss Marple offered a kind smile. It's often in what we don't think is important that the truth likes to hide. Mrs. Alton hesitated, folding her hands before her. "Clara was a diligent worker," she said at last. "Quiet, respectful. She kept her tasks in good order. And yet," Miss Marple said gently, It seems she was unsettled yesterday. Others have noticed it. A shadow crossed Mrs. Alton's features, brief but unmistakable. Girls have their moods, she replied too quickly. It isn't my place to pry. But you did notice a change, Weatherby pressed. Mrs. Alton looked away. The linen she'd been folding sagged in her grip. She was jumpy, she admitted. Kept glancing out toward the orchard. Dropped a teapot in the scullery, and that wasn't like her. When I asked if something was wrong, she said she hadn't slept well. Miss Marple's eyes softened with understanding. And did she mention anyone in particular who troubled her? No, the housekeeper said firmly. But her fingers tightened over the linen as if wringing something unspoken. But she wasn't herself after last Thursday. Weatherby seized on it. Thursday? What happened Thursday? Mrs. Alton shifted, caught between duty and fear. There was a visitor, she said reluctantly. A man who came asking for Sir Alistair. Tall, well-dressed, polite enough, but Clara seemed wary of him. Almost frightened. A visitor, Weatherby repeated. And neither Sir Alistair nor his staff mentioned this? Sir Alistair isn't here to mention anything, Mrs. Alton replied quietly. And the others didn't see him. Clara met him at the side entrance. I thought nothing of it at the time, just a stranger seeking directions. But afterward, Clara avoided the east wing entirely for the rest of the day. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Weatherby that carried a ripple of realization. The frightened figure Emily had seen at the window. A man too well dressed to fit the villager's descriptions. A button from a gentleman's coat left beneath a portrait. And now a mysterious visitor whose presence Clara seemed desperate to keep away from prying eyes. Mrs. Alton, Miss Marple said with gentle insistence, did Clara know this man? The woman pressed her lips together. I can't say, but she reacted as though she did. Weatherby exhaled sharply, tension tightening his shoulders. We'll need a full description of him, Mrs. Alton, every detail you can recall. I remember little, she murmured, only that his coat was very fine, dark wool, and he wore gloves, even though the day was warm. Cloth against cloth. A gloved man would leave behind little trace except perhaps a button torn loose by haste or struggle. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the portrait's shifted position, to Clara's desperation in the orchard, to the candlestick hidden beneath the bench. Someone had crossed the boundary between appearance and truth, and Clara had been caught in the middle. Mrs. Alton, Miss Marple added softly. Did Clara ever mention why she stopped going into the gallery? The housekeeper's composure finally slipped. Yes, she whispered. She said someone had been in there at night, that she heard them whispering. When she opened the door, the portrait was tilted. Weatherby looked up sharply. Tilted? Before yesterday. Mrs. Alton nodded, tears threatening. Yes, but she begged me not to report it. She said it would only make things worse. Miss Marple reached out, touching the woman's arm with grandmotherly kindness. Some burdens become dangerous when carried alone. The housekeeper swallowed, struggling to steady herself. She was afraid of something she couldn't bring herself to name. Weatherby's frustration resurfaced, heavy and unresolved. Afraid of what? Afraid of whom? Mrs. Alton shook her head helplessly. Miss Marple, however, felt a new certainty forming, still formless but unmistakable, like a familiar silhouette emerging through fog. Not enough to accuse, but more than enough to guide her next step. Her eyes lowered briefly, then lifted again with quiet resolve. There is someone, she murmured, half to herself, we have yet to speak with. Someone who may finally tell us what Clara feared. And as the idea crystallized, her gaze shifted toward the front of the house, toward a room occupied by someone who knew the family's history far too well. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed toward the front of the house, the faintest hint of purpose settling in her expression. Inspector Weatherby noticed the shift and followed her line of sight, brow furrowing. "Who do you have in mind?" he asked. "The one person," Miss Marple replied softly, "who knows the Stanton family history better than anyone still living and who has remained conspicuously silent through all this." Weatherby exhaled slowly. "Sir Alister's aunt, Lady Agnes," Miss Marple confirmed with a faint nod. They moved together toward the west wing, where Lady Agnes Stanton kept her suite, modest, elegant, and untouched by modern indulgence. The hall here felt different, quieter, insulated from the household commotion, a corridor caught in its own memory. Weatherby knocked. After a pause, a thin, composed voice answered, "Do come in." Lady Agnes sat by the window in a high-backed chair, lace collar pristine, her silver hair arranged with precise elegance. She watched them with calm, appraising eyes that held the weight of someone who had seen more truths than she ever chose to speak aloud. "Inspector. Miss Marple." She gestured gracefully. "I wondered when one of you would appear." Miss Marple offered a polite incline of her head. "Lady Agnes, I fear this must be a distressing day for you." The older woman's lips pressed into a thin, brittle line. "Death in one's home is never pleasant, but the Stantons have endured their share of unpleasantness. One learns a certain resiliency." Weatherby stepped forward. "We have reason to believe Clara Henshaw may have been afraid in the days before her death." Lady Agnes's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. Clara was a sensible girl. Fear did not suit her. And yet, Miss Marple said gently, she seemed unsettled after receiving a visitor last Thursday, a well-dressed man who asked for Sir Alister. The older woman's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. "Ah, so that little episode has resurfaced." She sighed. "I saw him, though I doubt I should have." "You recognized him?" Weatherby asked sharply. "Not at first." Her gaze drifted toward the window. "But when he walked away, I remembered that stride. Stanton men always walked with a certain self-importance." Miss Marple felt a delicate shift inside her chest, quiet recognition meeting the faint chill of confirmation. "You are suggesting," she said carefully, "that the visitor was a member of the Stanton family." Lady Agnes looked at her with the weary dignity of someone revealing a truth she had hoped to keep folded away. "Sir Alister has a brother, Edward. Estranged for years." "Estranged?" Weatherby repeated. "For behavior unbefitting the Stanton name," Lady Agnes replied crisply. "Debts, scandals, vanished one winter and never properly returned. The family chose not to speak of him." Her voice softened, "But he has resurfaced before briefly and disastrously." Miss Marple allowed the words to settle like dust slowly drifting toward the floor. "Edward Stanton, a man with motive, desperation, and the advantage of familiarity. A man Clara might have known or feared." "You didn't inform the police of his visit," Weatherby said, not accusatory, but bewildered. Lady Agnes stiffened. "I informed no one. Appearances are delicate things, Inspector. And a family's reputation—" She stopped, throat tightening. "Sir Alister has worked tirelessly to restore it." "Clara's life was at stake," Weatherby said quietly. Lady Agnes closed her eyes briefly. "I did not know. I thought only that Edward wanted money." Her voice cracked like thin ice. "I never imagined this." Miss Marple observed her with soft empathy but also clear discernment. "Did Clara speak to you about him?" Lady Agnes hesitated too long. "Then, no." The single syllable hung unsteadily. It was not untruthful, but it was incomplete. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Lady Agnes, sometimes the absence of conversation is more revealing than confession." A tremor passed through the older woman's composure. "Clara avoided me," she admitted. Whenever Edward was mentioned in passing, she changed the subject. I suspected she had met him before, but I could not press her. She was fragile in matters of the heart. A silence followed, heavy, Suggestive. Weatherby's breath caught. "You think, Clara, and Edward, I think," Lady Agnes said sharply, "that desperation drives people into unwise attachments. Then softer and unwise attachments lead to ruined lives." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the ornate mirror above the mantel, its reflection slicing the room into fragments. A symbolic echo-truth fractured by fear. Appearances protecting what they should expose. "Lady Agnes," Miss Marple asked quietly, "did Edward leave anything behind? A coat? A letter? Anything Clara might have kept?" The older woman did not answer. Her eyes had shifted not toward Miss Marple, not toward the inspector, but toward the wardrobe standing discreetly near the corner of the room. Weatherby followed her gaze, his breath tightening. Miss Marple lowered her voice to a whisper. "Lady Agnes, what is inside that wardrobe?" The older woman's silence deepened into something far more telling than words. Lady Agnes did not approach the wardrobe. She merely stared at it, as though the polished wood carried a pulse of its own. The silence lengthened until even the ticking of the distant hall clock seemed hesitant, reluctant to intrude on whatever truth trembled within that narrow space. Miss Marple watched her with steady gentleness, never pressing, merely waiting, allowing the older woman's conscience to find its own way forward. Inspector Weatherby cleared his throat. "Lady Agnes," he said carefully, "if something is in that wardrobe that pertains to this investigation, we must see it." For a moment, Lady Agnes did not move. Then, with a hand that trembled despite her carefully schooled composure, she rose from the chair. The slight shuffle of fabric against carpet felt like a confession in itself. Her fingers grasped the wardrobe's brass handle, paused, then pulled it open. Inside hung a single dark wool coat. Not Sir Alister's, not Cruft's. A gentleman's coat of finer, weave elegant, expensive, unmistakably metropolitan in style. A coat belonging to the sort of man who cared a great deal about appearance and very little about propriety. Inspector Weatherby's jaw tightened. Edward Stanton's. Lady Agnes closed her eyes but did not deny it. He left it here when he visited. He said he would return for it later. Her voice wavered. "I should have told you sooner, but I hoped foolishly that his presence had nothing to do with Clara's death." Miss Marple stepped closer, peering at the coat with quiet scrutiny. One sleeve hung slightly askew, stitched recently, the thread newer than the rest of the garment. Lady Agnes noticed her interest. "It tore," she said faintly. "He caught it on the gallery door. Clara offered to mend it, but he refused. He said he didn't have time." Weatherby moved behind Miss Marple, eyes narrowing. "Turn the sleeve," he instructed. Lady Agnes hesitated, then obeyed. When she folded the fabric back, a small strip of broken thread protruded the remains of a button torn from its place. Weatherby inhaled sharply. "The button found beneath the portrait of this coat is missing its match." Lady Agnes swayed as though struck. She pressed a hand to her chest. "Edward isn't a killer," she whispered. "He's careless, selfish, but he isn't cruel." Miss Marple watched her kindly, though her mind charted the implications with mounting clarity. "Fear makes people behave unpredictably," she murmured, "as does desperation." "And Clara?" Lady Agnes asked in a broken voice. "Was she involved with him?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, a tremor of light passing through the lace curtains. Appearances against truth. Hidden desires against public reputation. The pattern repeated itself in every corner of the case. "We don't yet know the nature of their connection," she answered. "But it was certainly significant." Weatherby examined the coat further. He hid this here deliberately. If he meant to return for it, why didn't he? "Perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "because something frightened him more than the need for retrieval." Lady Agnes flinched. Weatherby straightened. "We need to find Edward Stanton immediately." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, but her tone held a note of caution. And when we do, Inspector, we must ask not only what he saw, but what he feared. Weatherby paused at the doorway, coat draped over his arm. You believe someone else was involved? Miss Marple lifted her eyes with quiet certainty. I believe Clara's death involved more than a single moment of violence. It involved a chain of silences, omissions, and concealed relationships. Edward is a piece of that chain, but I do not yet think he is its end. Lady Agnes sank back into her chair, hands clasped tightly. If Edward harmed Clara, she whispered, I will never forgive myself. Miss Marple moved to her side, laying a gentle hand upon the older woman's shoulder. There is seldom one person alone to blame when tragedies take root in secrecy. Sometimes, Lady Agnes, the soil itself is at fault, rich with old grievances, old mistakes, old shadows. A faint knock at the door interrupted them. A constable entered, cap in hand, looking unsettled. Inspector, message from the Orchard search party. Weatherby stiffened. What is it? We found tracks, sir, leading further into the woods, and signs of a struggle, broken branches, footprints circling around each other. He swallowed. But no one is there now. Whoever it was is moving deeper in. Weatherby muttered a frustrated curse. Keep searching. Double the perimeter. Yes, sir. When the constable departed, the room fell into a thin, uncertain quiet. The fading light filtered across Lady Agnes's face, illuminating her distress in delicate, unguarded lines. We are running out of time, Weatherby said grimly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and time has a way of hardening certain truths while allowing others to slip through our fingers entirely. Her gaze moved back to the wardrobe, an ordinary piece of furniture now bearing the weight of a family's unspoken history. The coat's shadow stretched across the carpet like a dark path pointing toward the woods, toward a man who carried secrets in every thread he wore. Miss Marple exhaled softly, her mind moving in its quiet, precise way. We must go to the orchard, she said. Not simply to find Edward, but to understand what Clara may have discovered there. Weatherby nodded, urgency sharpening his posture. But Lady Agnes, pale and trembling, lifted her head with a fragile, wavering breath. There is something else, she whispered. Miss Marple turned toward her, gently attentive. Lady Agnes hesitated, then spoke the words she had held back too long. Clara wasn't the only one receiving letters. Miss Marple leaned closer, her expression gentle but unwavering. Lady Agnes's confession hovered in the room like a trembling candle flamesmall, flickering, yet capable of throwing the entire investigation into new relief. Inspector Weatherby stepped forward as well, the tension sharpening the lines along his jaw. Letters, he repeated. What letters? Lady Agnes seemed to fold inward, her composure loosening thread by thread. They were unsigned, she whispered. Left discreetly on the small table outside my room. At first I assumed they were harmless charity requests, notes from the parish committee. But when I opened one, her voice thinned. It wasn't meant for me. It was meant to warn me. Miss Marple took the older woman's hand, steadying its tremor. Warn you of what, Lady Agnes? The reply came brittle, as though the words themselves resisted emerging after being caged too long. To keep Edward's return quiet. To tell no one, not even Alistair. Her breath hitched, and to ensure Clara remained uninvolved. Weatherby's brows drew sharply together. Someone threatened you. Not outright, Lady Agnes murmured. But the tone was unmistakable. Whoever wrote them wished to protect Edward or hide him. She swallowed heavily, and wished Clara kept silent as well. Miss Marple felt a delicate chill cross her skin. The secrecy surrounding Edward was no longer a family matter. It was part of a pattern, a tightening web. Do you still have the letters? Lady Agnes closed her eyes. One. I destroyed the first in fear it might be discovered. The second I kept. I don't know why. Perhaps, Miss Marple thought, because guilt has a way of preserving what fear tries to erase. Lady Agnes rose shakily, went to the drawer of her writing desk, and withdrew a small, cream-coloured envelope. The flap had been opened carefully, but not lovingly. The edges bore faint impressions of fingers that had hesitated before unfolding it. Weatherby took the paper inside and scanned the brief slanted writing, "Keep your silence. Edward must not be drawn into old scandals again. Clara must not interfere. The past is safer than confession." He exhaled sharply. "This handwriting is deliberately disguised, and no signature." Miss Marple touched the paper lightly. The strokes were steady, controlled by someone determined not to reveal more than necessary. "The writer," she murmured, "is someone who knows this household intimately. Someone who fears exposure more than the stain of suspicion." Lady Agnes sat down again, visibly drained. "I wanted to show Clara, to reassure her that she wasn't alone in her worry. But the next day she avoided me entirely. And I thought you thought keeping quiet would protect her," Miss Marple finished gently. Lady Agnes nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I was wrong." Weatherby paced, agitation pulling tight across his shoulders. "So we have Edward hiding in the woods, a threatening letter, a frightened housemaid, and a missing candlestick used as a weapon hidden under a garden bench." He threw up his hands. "Every direction leads to more shadows." Miss Marple considered him with a soft tilt of her head. "Not shadows, Inspector. Merely pieces whose arrangement has not yet been made clear." Weatherby paused. "Do you see the arrangement?" "Only faintly," she replied. "Like a portrait seen through glass, not fully revealed, but its outline is becoming familiar." The symbolic echo was not lost on him. The portrait in the gallery shifted subtly from its place, the first sign that something was wrong. People, too, had shifted. Lady Agnes's silence, Cruft's trembling hands, Rowan's evasions, Emily's frightened figure in the window. The entire village had moved slightly off its axis. A constable appeared suddenly at the doorway, breathless. "Inspector, news from the orchard search. There's a fresh trail leading toward the old mill path. But there's something else." Weatherby tensed. "What?" "A scrap of pink paper found caught on a bramble. Part of a letter." Miss Marple's eyes lifted sharply. Pink paper. The color Alice had mentioned, Clara's private letters tied with ribbon. A person does not tear such a letter lightly. Weatherby motioned briskly. "Bring it here." The constable stepped forward, holding a small square of torn paper. The writing was only partially visible. Ink smeared where moisture had touched it, but enough remained to suggest a hurried, emotional hand. Miss Marple read the few intact words, "Can't continue. They will find out, meet me before dawn." The faint chill she'd felt earlier deepened, not with fear, but with recognition. This is Clara's handwriting. Weatherby's eyes widened. A meeting before dawn? With whom? Edward. Possibly, Miss Marple said. But Clara's tone is one of urgency, not affection. She was afraid of the consequences. It speaks of someone she felt compelled to help, yet feared would bring ruin upon them both. Lady Agnes buried her face in her hands. If only she had come to me, Miss Marple looked at the older woman tenderly. When young hearts try to carry burdens alone, they often mistake secrecy for protection. Weatherby pocketed the scrap. "We must follow the mill path. Edward may still be near." "Yes," Miss Marple said, rising. "But let us tread carefully. A desperate man may flee, but a desperate man who feels cornered may do something far worse." She paused near the doorway, feeling the heaviness of the old house pressing around them, the weight of its portraits, its secrets, its silences. Then she turned back toward Lady Agnes, one last time. "Before we go, is there anyone else?" she asked softly, "who knew Edward had returned? Anyone who might have wished to keep that knowledge buried even at Clara's expense?" Lady Agnes hesitated, lips trembling. "There is one person," she whispered. "But I pray I'm mistaken." Miss Marple waited, heart steady. Lady Agnes lifted her eyes, full of dread. Mr. Leonard Croft. The name hung in the air like a chill that had been waiting behind the door, ready to seep in the moment it was spoken. Inspector Weatherby's shoulders stiffened, and Miss Marple felt the delicate shift of tension subtle, telling, like a filament vibrating at the faintest touch. "Leonard Croft," Weatherby repeated quietly, an edge creeping into his voice. Why would he know Edward had returned? Lady Agnes looked away, shame softening her features, because he and Edward were acquainted. Many years ago, before the estrangement, before the scandals. Miss Marple absorbed that with delicate calm. "Acquainted," she murmured, letting the word settle. "An interesting choice." Lady Agnes clasped her hands tightly. Mr. Croft once admired Edward and looked up to him even. But Edward used that admiration carelessly. There were debts, promises, a quarrel that ended badly. "Blackmail?" Weatherby asked bluntly. Lady Agnes hesitated. "I can't say." But Croft's pride was bruised. He never forgave Edward for humiliating him. Miss Marple felt the weight of that detail fall neatly into place like a puzzle piece forming the bridge between two previously distant shapes. Pride, humiliation, old debts, such things fester quietly, especially in a village where appearances must be kept polished. "Inspector," Miss Marple said softly, "we should speak to Mr. Croft at once." Weatherby agreed with a curt nod. He took Lady Agnes's statement, then strode out of the West Wing with purposeful urgency. Miss Marple followed at her measured pace, her expression one of quiet, focused contemplation. The afternoon light had softened into a muted gold as they crossed the green. The village was stirring with hushed anxiety. Rumors spread like ripples through still water. Curtains twitched, doors closed quickly, and yet nothing felt resolved, only tightened, like a knot pulled from multiple directions. Croft's house sat near the churchyard, prim and symmetrical, with flower beds too tidy to be innocent. The front curtains were half drawn, though not fully just enough to observe without being noticed. Weatherby knocked. A beat of silence. Then the door opened a fraction. Mr. Croft stood there, thin-lipped, posture rigid. His eyes darted past them, as if checking whether anyone else had witnessed their arrival. "Inspector," he said, strained politeness stretching over unease. "Miss Marple." "We need to speak inside," Weatherby said. "It's urgent." Croft lingered a moment too long before stepping back to let them in. His sitting room was immaculately arranged, but the air felt stale, heavy with the remnants of anxiety. A tea tray sat half-cleared, as though abandoned mid-task. "What is this about?" Croft asked tightly. "Your connection to Edward Stanton," Weatherby replied with no preamble. Croft's breath hitched. "I don't know what you mean." "You were seen with him in the orchards," Weatherby pressed. "You had private meetings with Clara. You visited old Stanton House yesterday, and now we know Edward is hiding somewhere near the estate." Croft tried for indignation, but it crumbled at the edges. "I met Edward once. Briefly. We exchanged a few words. Nothing more. And Clara." He faltered, voice thinning. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Mr. Croft, fear often makes liars of those who are not liars by nature." His eyes flickered. "I'm not afraid," he insisted. But he was. The trembling of his hand gave it away. "Then tell us what happened," Miss Marple urged softly. Croft sat heavily in his armchair, the posture of a man whose armor had fractured. "Edward returned 2 weeks ago," he confessed. "He needed money, said he had a plan, something that required access to the house." Weatherby's jaw tightened. "Did Clara know?" Croft nodded, misery creeping into his eyes. Edward charmed her. He always charmed people. She thought she was helping him, but the moment she realized what he intended, she panicked. What did he intend? Weatherby demanded. Croft shook his head helplessly. He never told me, only said there was something valuable, something he had a claim to. And Clara overheard our argument. She thought Edward would ruin the family. She said she'd go to Lady Agnes. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, and Edward feared exposure. A single tear slipped down Croft's cheek, though he did not seem aware of it. I tried to dissuade her, tried to convince her to stay out of it. But she said she couldn't. She said honesty mattered more than anything. A soft, painful truth. "And did you meet her in the orchard last night?" Miss Marple asked. Croft swallowed hard. "Yes. She begged me to tell Edward to leave. Said she'd already written him a note to meet her at dawn to settle things." And then Weatherby pressed. Croft's mouth quivered. I left her there. She was crying. She said she was afraid but determined. His voice dropped to a broken whisper. "When I saw her body this morning, I thought he covered his face. I thought Edward must have done it." Weatherby absorbed the explanation grimly. "And you told no one?" "I was ashamed," Croft admitted. "Ashamed of ever being involved with him, ashamed of failing Clara." His voice cracked. "She trusted me." Miss Marple regarded him with deep compassion, but not absolution. "Mr. Croft," she said softly, "shame is a heavy burden, but it does not make you a murderer." Croft looked up sharply, searching her face for absolution or accusation. Finding neither, he sagged in confusion. "I don't understand." Miss Marple's expression softened with a quiet, complex sorrow. "You are hiding guilt, Mr. Croft," she said. "But not the guilt of killing Clara." Croft stared at her, trembling. "Then who?" Miss Marple inhaled gently, her eyes drifting toward the window, toward the estate grounds where truth had been circling like a wounded creature. "We need to find Edward," she murmured. "Because whatever happened at dawn, someone else was there as well." Her voice dropped further, a whisper threaded with certainty. "And that person is far more dangerous than Edward Stanton." Inspector Weatherby stared at Miss Marple, startled by the quiet certainty in her voice. The lamplight in Croft's sitting room caught the faint tremor in his hands, a tension born of days spent navigating half-truths. But Miss Marple's eyes had taken on a steadiness that suggested she finally saw the pattern whole. "We must go back to old Stanton House," she said gently, "before darkness deepens and memories grow foggy. The truth is still waiting there." Croft made a faint, strangled sound. "If Edward isn't the killer, then who?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed a hand on the arm of Croft's chair, reassuring. "It is often the person who moves most quietly around a household, Mr. Croft, the one who knows its rhythms better than its master. Someone who sees everything and is seen by almost no one." Croft's eyes widened. "The servants?" Weatherby stiffened, realization coiling through him like a tightening wire. "Mrs. Alton." Miss Marple's expression softened with sorrow, not triumph. "Yes, I fear so." The inspector swore under his breath. But she seemed devastated, genuinely grieving. "People often grieve for the lives they wished they'd had," Miss Marple murmured, "not the ones they ruined." They left Croft in stunned silence and crossed the village at a brisk pace. A cold wind swept in from the orchards, carrying the scent of earth and bruised apples. Dusk had gathered in thickening layers by the time they reached the Stanton estate, and the house loomed above them like a solemn witness to its own secrets. Inside, the hallways felt quieter than before, too quiet. Mrs. Alton was nowhere in sight. A lone lamp flickered near the east gallery entrance. Weatherby drew a breath. "She's here." Miss Marple stepped forward first, her tread soft as thought. The gallery stretched before them, long and dim, the portrait at the far end thrown into half-shadow. For a moment, one could almost believe the painted matriarch's expression had tightened again, its gaze sharpened, watching the proceedings with tacit judgment. Near the side table beneath it stood Mrs. Alton. Her posture was stiff, her hands clasped tightly around a folded cloth. She didn't turn as they entered, though she must have heard their steps brushing against the gallery's old carpet. "It didn't have to come to this," she said softly, her voice hollow. Clara was a sweet girl, but sweet girls make foolish choices. Weatherby advanced. Mrs. Alton put the cloth down and turned around. She obeyed slowly, revealing the cloth to be covering a silver object. The second candlestick is its twin. Miss Marple felt a pang of quiet sadness. Matching instruments, matching intentions. Mrs. Alton's gaze landed on Miss Marple first. A small, resigned smile touched the corners of her lips. "I thought you might be the one to understand." Miss Marple held her eyes with gentle gravity. "Explain it to us, my dear." The housekeeper exhaled as though releasing something long pent up. Edward came to Clara. Promised her things. Promised he'd clear his debts, run away with her once he claimed his inheritance from Sir Alistair. A bitter edge entered her tone. A fantasy. He lied to her. He lied to everyone. Weatherby's jaw clenched, but that does not explain murder. Mrs. Alton's gaze flickered. No, that came later. When Clara realized Edward was planning to take something from the house papers, heirlooms, I don't know, and she told me she was going to expose him. She meant well, poor child, but she didn't understand what exposure would do. The cloth slipped slightly, revealing the gleam of the candlestick's engraved crest. He would have dragged the Stanton name back through the mud. Mrs. Alton whispered, "Lady Agnes has borne enough. Sir Alistair, too. Their reputation is the only thing they have left." Her voice trembled with a fierce, misguided loyalty. "So," Miss Marple said quietly, "you tried to stop Clara?" Mrs. Alton nodded. "I met her in the gallery early this morning. She was crying. She said she'd already written to Edward. She said she couldn't keep silent." Tears filled her eyes. "I only meant to frighten her. I swear it, to make her reconsider." But she backed away and she tripped. Her breath broke. The candlestick was already in my hand. It happened so quickly. A silence settled, heavy, mournful. Weatherby stepped forward, cuffs in hand. "Mrs. Alton, you are under arrest." But she held up a hand, pleading, "Please, before you take me, tell Lady Agnes I only ever meant to protect her." Miss Marple's expression was full of compassion, but her voice held quiet truth. Protection built on silence often becomes its own kind of danger. Mrs. Alton bowed her head. "I know." Weatherby led her away, her footsteps echoing down the gallery, fading into the dim corridor beyond. When they were gone, Miss Marple remained before the portrait. The stern figure seemed different, no less accusatory, more sorrowful, as though it too recognized how human frailty weaves tragedy out of misplaced loyalty. Inspector Weatherby returned, looking weary. "You saw it sooner than any of us?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, I only saw the pattern. Mrs. Alton saw everything else long before we did." He sighed. "St. Mary Mead will talk about this for months." "Ah," Miss Marple replied softly. "But beneath all the talk, there will be kindness. Clara will be remembered fondly. And Mrs. Alton, well, even in judgment, one should make room for pity." Outside, the last of the daylight slipped behind the trees. The village exhaled, settling back into the fragile rhythm of its rituals. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and turned toward the door, her steps light, thoughtful. Another mystery closed, another sorrow folded into the quiet fabric of village life.